Welcome everybody to the meeting itself. Paul and my name is Jon McDonnell, by the way. I'm the Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington. I'm looking a bit scruffy at the moment, but there you are. Paul and I have been doing meetings right the way through the last couple of months, all the way through literally different regions, different groups within UNISON, etc., to talk about the General Secretary election. Because I think everyone realises this is most probably the most important election we've had in the union for over a generation, and that's why it's important that we get it right. I'm a UNISON member. I was a member of UP. I was a shop steward for UP before the merger that brought us all into UNISON. So I've been a UNISON member since the foundation of the union itself. And when Dave Prentice announced that he was standing down and that there would be an election, I think many of us realised the significance of it. And we basically wanted someone to stand who, I suppose the fairest way of saying it, who would make sure that the union was given back to its members. Because in the long tradition of our union, I remember in UP, we always prided ourselves that UP was a member-led union, thoroughly democratic, and it stood out for that. Actually, it stood out well in comparison with other unions for being member involvement, member-led, branches making their decision, backed by the national union, and willing to engage in campaigning, but if necessary, willing to engage in action as well, and that included industrial action. So that we transferred that sort of, if you like, culture from COSI, from UP, and now go into UNISON. But my view at the moment is that I think that culture, to a large extent, has been undermined. And so I want the UNISON in the future to go back to being a member-led union, in which we have a general secretary who's a rank and file member with a experience of what it's like on the ground, negotiating, representing, and if necessary, supporting and developing action. But also, I want a general secretary that will give direction to this union as well, making sure that our voice is heard again nationally in terms of what we do in regard to our negotiations with employers, of course, but also nationally in terms of how we present our arguments in the media and mobilise and recruit as a result of that, and nationally in relation to what we do in terms of politics, and that includes our voice within the Labour Party. So that's why I thought, well, this election would be absolutely key in securing that return to being a member-led union. And that's why when we persuaded Paul, when Paul said he was willing to stand, many of us were over the moon, to be honest, because he suited the job description, as far as I'm concerned, the person's specification. He's a rank and file member. He's got a long history at branch level of negotiations, winning negotiations, and being always back in the members. A long history of making sure that I suppose really that when we go into national discussions and negotiations, he has a long history of representation on the executive and all the rest of it. A real professional, in other words. But more importantly, that he's a rank and file solid member. Someone who believes with me that this union believes to its members, not to any bureaucracy that's established. So that's why we were over the moon that Paul was willing to put his name forward to the General Secretary. And now what we've got to do is, if you believe the same as I do, that he's the right man for the job, that's exactly what we want, we've got to make sure we vote for him when we get that vote out. So today's meeting is all about basically having that discussion about what Paul's views are, the direction he wants to take the union in, the way in which he wants to fulfill those ambitions. And there's a whole range of speakers. So let me introduce first of all Paul himself. And I just want to thank everyone for attending today, for coming online. I know it can be difficult at times, but I think once you've heard Paul, you'll be motivated like me to go out there and get this vote out to support him. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name's Paul Holmes. I'm a candidate for the General Secretary election. I haven't met anybody that's got a ballot paper, but they're supposed to be out today. And really, I want to stress, really, that I'm a lay member candidate. And I think for 95% of the members, using that expression wouldn't mean anything. But it means something in the rule book, which says we're a lay member-led union. And it means something to the activists. And what we're saying to the members by having a lay member-led candidate and a lay member-led union, what we're saying to the members is the gaps become too big. The branches and the national and regional union are gaps grown up between them, and they're not relating to each other properly. You know, it was really clear when the union was formed what the role of full-time officers was. And it's evolved into continuously telling people what they can't do. And, you know, for me, it's really clear there's two sorts of general secretaries, there's two sorts of unions. Ones that tell you what you can't do, and ones that tell you what you can do. And it's about what you can do. It's about the union. The retired members are people who, by and large, who were proud to be union members and made an effort to carry on being a union member. And for a start off, I don't like the term retired members because it implies in the name that you've retired from the union when what you've retired from is your employment. But our retired members are still citizens of Britain. There's still people faced by the problems with care homes, adult social care, the problems with free TV licenses for the over 75s, the tax on pensions, the state of the National Health Service, COVID. They're faced by the problems of citizens. They're actually UNISON members who should be given a far bigger voice in the union because they're just members. That's what they are. They don't happen to be working at this moment in time, even though some of them do dip in and out of work as suits themselves. The third thing about retired members, as far as I'm concerned, is there's a wealth of experience in there that you can never find. I remember when I started, some of the things I were told by people who were getting to retirement age, union officials, didn't make much sense to me in my first year as a steward. But I tell you what, a lot of it's clicked over the years. It's like gold, that sort of advice. And we need, if we're going to, part of my campaign is to put the power back in the branches. The power, if you get the power as the General Secretary, you want to give it away straight away. And, you know, the three planks in my campaign now, one, the amount of money on average that the branches get will double from 25% to 50%. Two, that if you want to be involved in the politics of this union and the policies of this union and that's formation, you are either an ordinary member or you're an elected official. So I would want to see the 5 assistant general secretaries and the 12 regional secretaries elected, and then they can campaign on the policies of the union and be accountable to the union. That's one of the things that's gone in the giant mergers that's taken place. Must admit, there were a time in sort of the 70s and 80s when, you know, I thought, oh, some of these big unions are being formed from crap unions. They'd be more powerful. But by and large, a lot of the power has ebbed away and been replaced by collecting subscriptions, buying buildings and having money in the bank, not using the giant power of the union. And I've said it, I think, at every meeting, that, you know, we are the biggest union in Britain, but we don't act or fight like we're the biggest union. I don't think our members think we're the biggest union. We don't carry that authority within the movement. So I want to put the union on the front foot. I want it to be speaking on things. I want it on Question Time. I want it on Newsnight. I want it being there talking to the members, not acquiescing to those who run this country and saying, oh, thank you for the crumbs that you've given us, but saying what it is we want. And, you know, for any member of the union, particularly any member in local government, over the last 3 weeks, there can't be anything but horrified by the introduction of the exit cap on leaving payments, exit payments in local government and the whole public sector, but also the proposals to say that if you're over 55 and you're made compulsory redundant, you won't necessarily get an unreduced pension. In fact, you probably won't. They're looking to reduce your pension, make you make a contribution from your lump sum, or delay your pension even though you've been made redundant, or take away your statutory redundancy payments. Now, it's not 12 years ago, 13 years ago, we got rid of the right, following a dispute which we could easily have won, to go at 50 if you were made compulsorily redundant. In the next dispute after that, We lost the rule of 85 in local government, which meant at 60, you could automatically retire on full pension if you got 25 years service. And by and large, the government is streets ahead of us. They're planning what they want to do. And we're saying, oh, don't do it so badly. The dented shield is so dented, it's almost inside out. And this campaign is about changing this union. One of the great things about this campaign has been the involvement of people. There's been literally hundreds of activists involved. And it's given those activists a glimpse of what the union could be like, where actually somebody doesn't tick a box to say, oh, I wonder what their politics are, whether I want them involved or I don't want them involved. When the question is, have you got something to offer? And if you've got something to offer and you're keen to change the union, then we want you involved. And that's what this campaign's been about. It's been a very democratic, non-micromanaged campaign. And it's hit far more the members than I think anybody else's campaign has. I'm really pleased about the people who's agreed to speak at this meeting today, because they're all people I respect in the movement. They're all people who've earned the spurs in the movement, who know about the movement. And they'll speak their mind. If we're doing something that they don't like, they'll say something. And that's what democracy is about. It's the key word that's missing from British politics. People are endlessly saying about this public service or that public service or where this funding's going, but nobody talks about democracy. Last year, 48% of local government expenditure went to democratic organisations and 52% went to outsourced bodies and private contractors. That 52% isn't under democratic control. And I'm such a fervent believer in democracy. I'll bring remarks to a conclusion, really. I want to change this union so that the power goes down as low as it can. I want the branches that are faced by being snowed under in workload to have loads of resources. I want full-time officers going there, or money going there, or advice going there. But I want it to be under their control, not saying what you can and can't do. They know what's applicable in their areas. It's a bit like phone calls you get during tracing and testing from people in different parts of the country. I spoke to somebody yesterday about Wakefield. They'd never heard of Wakefield. It's the capital of the West Riding with 3.4 million people live there. They've never heard of it. Well, you start losing confidence in somebody in that situation. That situation should have been with the local authorities and the local health. That's where it should have been. And that's how I see UNISON develop. I saw loads of letters last week about the Labour Party saying, well, none of the subscriptions come to the local Labour Party, so we've got no money to do anything. And the debate is the same everywhere. People are feeling more and more and more disenfranchised. The complete and utter farce over free school meals is just the tip of the iceberg about how disenfranchised people are feeling. They feel that things that are so important to them are not important to somebody else. So that's what I see this campaign about. I see this campaign about saying to the thousands of activists and 1.4 million members in Unison, including the retired members, they're just members like anybody else. This is your union. What do you want it to do? Not this is our union. We'll tell you what this union does. And that's the key factor. When people feel they're involved in the decision, we'll take part in the process. And that's what this election is about. So I'm glad everybody's come to the meeting and I'll answer questions. But this union needs to change, and it needs to change quickly. It won't be changed by one person. It'll be changed by the General Secretary election, the NEC election, and hopefully the conference next year. And then we can have a union that we're proud of. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks. As Paul has said, the key issue for us is the direction of this union. And well, we'll come on to questions later, but we've had these meetings right the way through this campaign. And the one thing that's come across loud and clear is that members want to change a direction. They want a democratic union. They want an activist and campaigning union. And every time we've had these meetings, the response has been, well, that's exactly what Paul will bring as he becomes General Secretary. And as Paul has mentioned, we've got a range of speakers, and then we'll go into questions and discussion. Okay, our first speaker is Bernie Gallagher. And Bernie, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, I'm Bernie Gallagher. I'm former branch secretary from Bolton Local Government Branch and NEC member. And I suppose the first thing I'd want to start off by saying is what a privilege it has been to be part of Paul's campaign. And I think it's worth reminding everyone that retired members, this is the only election that retired members get a vote, a national vote. And as they make up approximately 1/8 of the membership, it's really important that we get the retired members' vote out. I mean, as Paul said, people feel disenfranchised all over, and particularly retired members can. You know, we've been, many of us on this call, I think, will have been activists within our own branches, and then you can often feel disenfranchised and marginalised within the structures of Unison currently for retired members. So Paul's committed to address that disparity. I want to speak today because I know Paul really well, and I want to give you an insight into the skills and qualities that Paul's got to be not just a good leader, but I believe a great leader. Paul and I first met we were on a tube coming back from the Crystal Palace rally on the pensions, meeting on the pensions, where Paul was a keynote speaker at that event. And then we met again when we both got elected on the NEC. And I have to say, Paul's been incredibly supportive to me as a branch secretary and to our branch as a whole, regularly visiting the branch and offering support when we've gone through very, very difficult times. Now, I think everybody's got their own ideas about what a good leader should have, the skills and qualities, and sometimes we have to compromise those qualities when we're voting for someone. But I want to say, in terms of Paul, I don't think that is the case, other than he's not a woman. He's got all the qualities to be a really, really good leader. And sometimes this is where age is on your side. His experience, not just as an activist, as a branch secretary, working at a national level and a local level, but his own life experiences. And that's not something you can learn overnight. That comes with talking to people, going through the problems of life that all of us have. And that experience will be so important as a general secretary. The other thing Paul's got, I think, is the emotional intelligence. He understands how people tick and how our members tick, and often our leadership have got a very cynical view of members. Paul's not got that. He understands that sometimes members have had a bad experience of the union. And that's why that makes them perhaps cynical. So to do that, to be able to understand how members tick, you've got to listen. And I have to say, and many of us here, you know, if we're women, we've often criticised maybe our partners for not being good listeners. You know, I'm sort of making a gender-specific point there. But I have to say, I have never known anyone like Paul for listening. He really does listen, and he's often, you know, tick me off sometimes and say, "You're not listening, Bernie. You're not listening." So listening, I think, is an incredibly important character to have as a good leader. The other one is he doesn't want power just for the sake of power. He wants to create an environment where he empowers members and activists. And part of his pledges is to set up a leadership school. And my experience is there's been far too many branch secretaries or full-time officers who just want to keep that power to themselves. Paul's got a wealth of knowledge. You know, I've never known anybody with the knowledge he's got, you know, that he gets from reading, from lots and lots of various things. But the thing with Paul is he wants to share that knowledge. He doesn't want to keep it to himself. He wants to share it. And many a time, a package wings its way over from Wakefield to my house with a book or a pamphlet, or some article he's written or read. He just wants to share that knowledge, and that to me is a, like I said, a brilliant characteristic for a leader. He's also got a sense of purpose. He knows what's needed to transform Unison. But he can also show humility, and he will be the first person to admit if he's made a mistake and apologise. And there's not many good leaders do that. But Paul's, I think, I might be wrong here, but I think he's the only candidate that's got policy pledges for retired members. He wants to utilise those skills of retired members, particularly in the non-unionised workplaces in the voluntary sector. And you'll know as well as I will how much local government, that's my sector, has changed from a single employer to a multi-employers, where many of those workplaces are not unionised. The skills of retired members can be used within that sector. So Paul wants to devolve the resources to branches so that branches are able to support retired members, continue to train retired members so they can play a bigger role within the union. Another part of his policy pledge is better access for wellbeing facilities for retired members, which again, with better resources at a local level, he'll be able to, branches will be able to support retired members better. And just finally, I want to say another quality Paul's got is his humour. He always makes people smile, makes them laugh. So overall, I just think he, like I said, he's got the qualities not just to be a good leader, but a great leader. He will truly transform Unison. So in conclusion, I would just say, whoever you can speak to who has got a ballot in this election, get them to vote and get them to vote Paul Holmes. Thank you, Jon.
That's right. Okay. The thing about Zoom meetings is that the host who controls it can mute you as well. It can be very, especially if you've got a politician like me running on. Our next, thanks, Bernie, for that. That was great. By the way, people who've got questions or comments, use the chat box and put them in them, and we'll draw upon them when we come to the discussion period. Okay, our next speaker is Ruby Cox. Ruby used to be the branch secretary down in Tower Hamlets, and now she's the retired members secretary in East Sussex. Ruby.
Hi there. I thought Jon was an expert. Never mind. I'm more than happy to. I'm more than happy to go. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that what you said, Jon, about when you found out about Paul's candidacy, you felt over the moon. That's exactly how I felt. You know, that there was somebody who, you know, had a radical approach and understood the, you know, the depth of change that is actually needed within Unison, particularly with regard to retired members. So I've made a few notes. Excuse me if I look down, but I've only got 5 minutes, so I want to make sure I get it all in. So I'm Ruby Cox. I'm Secretary of East Sussex Retired Members Group, and I'm a councillor with Hastings Borough Council. So they've got some use for me anyway. Before I retired, I worked in Tower Hamlets for the best part of 25 years. I was a Unison activist at local and regional level. At one stage, I was Assistant Branch Secretary, and I was Chair of the Greater London International Committee for something like 10 years. And I remember clearly how much I looked forward to having more time to spend supporting Unison when I retired, and how disappointed and horrified I was to discover the very limited role that members have, that retired members have within Unison. Basically, you just end up making up the numbers as far as I can see. When I retired, my passion for international work, which is really important to me, led me to want to link with retired members in other countries. Why not? And since I was spending a lot of time in France, that was my first port of call. I was then a member of the Regional Retired Members Committee, South East Region. I made contact with the CGT, who were like our TUC, and they were very happy with the contact and wanted to work towards linking up with Unison retired members. It was all going very well until the powers that be, you never know who they are, at regional and national level has decided to stamp on it, and that was that. So even if we carried on ourselves, and I have found a way to maintain the contact with them, but we still wouldn't be representing Unison. So that was what they wanted to put a stop to. However, during that brief period when our project managed to stay unnoticed, I found out a lot about the CGT, how it treats its retired members. For a start, there's virtually no distinction between working and retired members. Once you're a union member, it's taken for granted that you will continue to be active. After retirement, there are many ways to do this. Retired members are used in smaller workplaces where there's no other reps, in educating those new to trade unions. They're used in campaigning, all sorts of other things, and no distinction is made either between campaigning for employment rights and the rights of citizens, including older people, to have a decent standard of living. So it's a completely different concept of union membership and of the role of the trade union as being a vehicle for social change, not just focusing on those in employment. Considerable resources are used to encourage retired members to remain active in their unions. Most importantly of all, there's absolutely no expectation at all that they will take a back seat. So that was really refreshing and very energizing as well. Secondly, I want to highlight, but in contrast, what a scandalous waste of resources it is for Unison to follow this ageist rhetoric, because that's what it is, of considering retired members past it are no longer useful in any meaningful way. With people who have been, for instance, branch secretaries, who have a wealth of knowledge and experience. One day they're fighting for the rights of their colleagues, and the next they've got virtually no say within their union and no way to share any of their expertise. This at a time when branch activists are increasingly under the cosh with less and less facility time and more cases to deal with. It's simply suicidal on Unison's part. There is an at least partial solution staring them in the face. Use your retired members, but because we have a leadership that's wedded to the idea that retired members have to know their place, it always falls on deaf ears. This is probably a familiar scenario to retired members. Year after year, our regional committee would submit motions to Retired Members Conference, asking that retired members be allowed to better support their branches, but they were always ruled out of order. And the last thing I want to say is that I find it utterly refreshing that Paul totally gets how much retired members want to support working members, how the issues that were important to them during their working lives are still important to them now, because they desperately want to see their children and grandchildren also have better life chances. And they know that they still have a part to play in achieving that. Unison should be working to unite the generations, not to separate them. And there is no true division now between working and retirement in an age when many pensioners have to work into their 70s and beyond because of meagre pensions and escalating bills. I truly believe that Paul offers the leadership we need and offers hope at a time when there is precious little of it around. We've had enough of same old, and we need something fresh and new. And I believe that is what Paul offers. So please vote for him. Thank you.
Ruby, thanks for that. That was terrific. And I'm sorry for jumping you up the list and surprising you. Great. Anyway, thanks for your contribution. Our next speaker is, as Ruby said, is Jon Rogers. Jon, as some people know, formerly on the NEC, who's Lambeth branch secretary. He's a member of Brighton Constituency Labour Party, and most of you will know him as a prolific Unison blogger. Jon, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, John. And yes, as John says, my name's Jon Rogers, although we all know our names now when we have these meetings because it's written down there in the corner. This is, in fact, the first meeting I think that I've spoken at as a Unison retired member, because I retired at sort of Christmas, end of the year last year. I was made redundant and retired. Got away with it before the exit payment cap. So since this is my first meeting as a retired member, I thought I should start by reminiscing and start at the beginning. In 1993, we created the new union, and I was in support of that. I thought that was a good idea. And as a young branch secretary at the time, what I wanted was to be, you know, in a branch that had the sort of the level of resources that a Nalgo branch had, and the level of branch autonomy, and also the ability to stop the bins being emptied, which a Newpie branch had. And that was my dream. That's what I thought we were creating. It was going to be a strong, militant trade union, and it was just going to be great. I was really looking forward to the second half of the 1990s, even though, you know, we still had John Major as Prime Minister. But what do we have now? Where have we ended up after all these years? We have under-resourced branches, policed by paid officials. We've had no successful national local government pay claim really in all the time of Unison. You know, that's the truth of it. You know, we had a campaign in 2002, out of which we got a local government pay commission and a brief halt in the relative decline of local government pay against everything else. But there you are, our biggest service group, and we haven't done anything positive for the standard of living of those workers with the strength we created in 1993. Similarly, that strength, that size has seemed completely useless in preventing the wave of privatisation that has led to the fragmentation of our membership and our bargaining. You know, we've gone from the situation where branches mostly dealt with one main employer and perhaps two or three others, to the situation where many local government branches have 100, 200 or more employers that they have to deal with. At the same time, and I think John alluded to this in his introductory remarks, there's been a gradual restriction of debate at conference. You know, I was very pleased to hear Paul talking about electing more of our senior officials. And I remember in the 1990s speaking in debates at conference about whether or not we should elect more of our senior officials. And we didn't win the argument, but we had the argument. And in latter years, that argument isn't allowed on the floor of conference anymore. The Standing Orders Committee has gradually restricted what people can speak about at Unison Conference. And alongside that, there have been successive waves of, well, call it what it is, political witch hunting of left-wing activists in the union. It's not permanent. It comes, it goes. There are cases and then there aren't cases. But it's happened often enough to form a pattern that sort of stains the life and the reputation of Unison over its whole existence. So it's certainly time for change in Unison. There's no doubt about that. And this election is an opportunity potentially for such change. Now, I took my time deciding where, you know, how I was going to vote in this election. I was genuinely perplexed, looking back at what we've done in the past, and wondering what's the best thing to do. Should we go for a candidate who's maybe a little bit better than the main establishment candidate and creates a little bit of room for people to organise? But in the end, the decisive factor for me is that Paul Holmes, who I served alongside on the NEC for many years, it represents rank and file organisation in the union. And that's what the union needs. Under any general secretary, we need activists in the union to be able to organise together independently of the union structures, and in particular, independently of the union's bureaucracy, if we're to hold that bureaucracy to account. And it's because the people who run the union recognise that fact, recognise how important that is, that they are forever desperately trying to clamp down on such rank and file organisation in increasingly absurd ways. And the one best thing we can do now, I think, is vote for Paul in this election to respond to those attacks. There's one particular policy that Paul has advocated that I'd like to mention. It's a slightly obscure one, but as John mentioned, I blog about Unison stuff, and I used to do it much more when I was on the NEC. And I'm a bit obsessive sometimes about issues that I get interested in. And I'd like to claim the credit for having coined the phrase, the great white elephant of the Euston Road, to describe Unison's headquarters building. I'm going to claim that I did that. Because although, and I'll put my hands up and admit that I was on the NEC in 2004 when we voted to build the building. But once we moved in there, it became obvious, for example, that for the first few years that the union occupied the building, 3 of the floors were just kept completely empty because we had nothing to do with them. We just didn't have enough staff to put in there, and had no idea, didn't make any money out of it or anything. And for those people in headquarters who attack Paul's other important pledge about decentralising resources to branches on the grounds that branches won't know how to spend the money, what I saw when I was on the NEC all those years, and I was on the NEC for 14 years, was I saw how the absolutely shoddy governance of the union at national level would allow the officials to waste money. I mean, £1 million of members' money was lost on Care Connect Learning, another £1 million wasted on the 3 Companies project. And never mind the waste involved in maintaining all that empty space in the great white elephant of the Euston Road. And I've seen people attack Paul for proposing to close down the building and say, oh my God, he'll make all the staff redundant. Well, I don't suppose all the staff are going into the office at the moment, or have been for the last 6 months. So I don't think it would make anyone redundant to get rid of that building. And I think it would be a truly symbolic move, symbolising the sort of radical change that Unison requires. And I think that's the point I finish on. My little bit of wisdom that I've got to offer after all my years as a Unison activist, now I'm a retired member and I hope to remain active, my little bit of wisdom is to say Unison needs radical change. And in this General Secretary election, Paul Holmes is the candidate of that truly radical change. So he's got my vote. I'll do what I can to persuade anyone I can talk to, anyone who will listen to me, to vote for Paul. And I hope everyone else here will do the same. It's been said, Bernie said it just now, retired members are 1/8 of the electorate in this election. And if we can drive up the turnout amongst retired members and amongst former activists amongst the retired members who know what's wrong with the union and know what needs to be done, then I think, everything is here to play for. And we should support Paul, and let's hope he can win. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that and the experience as well. Thanks for bringing up the great white elephant as well. Okay, our final speaker is George Burnett. George is the former branch secretary at Camden, and he's also now he's retired. He's the Tulo officer for the Hackney and Stoke Newington Labour parties. Him and Jon Rogers has most probably been the 2 people that have me on more picket lines over the last 40 years. No, George, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, John. I feel as though there's a bit of a role reversal this afternoon. I feel as though I should be introducing you. In any event, I'm very, very pleased to be sharing this online platform with Bernie, with Ruby, and of course with my old mucker, Jon Rogers, as well as Paul Holmes. And I'll start actually with a question that a member from the Camden branch, a retired member, posed to me a couple of weeks ago. And that is, why is Paul Holmes doing so much better than he was 10 years ago when he stood to be a candidate as General Secretary? And I stand by the answer I gave her then in 2 parts. There's a good reason, and that is the extraordinarily professional campaign on social media that a few comrades have been running over the last 6 to 8 weeks. But there's a bad reason as well, and that is the reality of the past decade of austerity and the union's utterly inadequate response to it. We could go on about the erosion of real pay for a huge proportion of our members, be they in local government or the NHS. We could go on about the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs that have been axed, particularly from local government over the past decade. And we could, of course, point to the fact that we now are living with worse pensions than we would have done a decade or so ago. But we have to be frank, although Unison has apparently seen growth against the backdrop of COVID, it is a smaller union than it was at the start of this century. And I think that's one index of failure, and a very, very good reason to be supporting the sort of radical change to which Jon referred in his speech a couple of minutes ago. Now, I first came across Paul Holmes back in 2006-07, and that was in the context of a battle with the then new Labour government over our pension scheme in local government. And Paul was the driving force, no doubt about it, behind the first ever special conference in the history of our union about the settlement of that dispute from 2006. In March 2007, I heard Paul speak at that special conference with both knowledge and passion. And I thought, this is a person to follow seriously. And over the intervening 13 years, I've not been disappointed. Paul's Kirklees branch was always one of the first ports of call for solidarity if you were looking to win practical backing for members who were taking industrial action. And during the course of disputes in 2012 and 2015, involving the traffic wardens on an outsourced contract with a company called NSL in Camden, it was Kirklees that was amongst the very first branches to send a message of support and a financial contribution to relieve the hardship amongst the extremely low paid workers on that contract. And whilst those disputes didn't win clear-cut victories, they did wring real concessions from the employer and, frankly, ultimately, Camden Council, which had outsourced, privatized that contract. Now, I've referred already to the pension scheme. Paul is unique amongst the candidates, in my view, in really sounding the alarm bells about what is happening in the wake of the imposition of the exit cap for public sector workers. And it is now finally the union nationally that has begun, albeit too late in the day and inadequately, to address the issue. But I have to wonder, if Paul hadn't been sounding the alarm, what would we have heard from 130 Euston Road? In addition, I think from the perspective of those of us who are over 60, over 65, what Paul has to say about the social care sector is extremely important. And I do think he is the General Secretary candidate best placed to give a meaningful lead by investing resources in the branches to enable them to recruit, to organize, and ultimately to mobilize members, new members, particularly in the social care sector, which is now unfortunately overwhelmingly privatized. So again, I think on that score, from the perspective of retired members, as citizens, as users of public services, Paul's candidacy is the one to watch and the one to support. Finally, we all know that this specter, the specter of COVID is haunting this country and indeed so much of the world. And the awful reality is that it's our members, be they employed or retired, who are all too likely to foot the bill unless and until there is radical change in our union and it becomes a force capable of resistance, capable of defending what we've got and actually winning meaningful gains for members, be they in employment or retired. So with all that in mind, this new voting bloc, about 12% of the electorate, in this contest needs to be mobilized over the next 4 weeks. And I urge everyone here not only to use their vote and vote for Paul Holmes, but to reach out to other retirees and those of us with friends still working in local government, the NHS, the voluntary sector, in those parts of the economy where Unison has members, to vote for radical change and to vote for Paul Holmes for General Secretary. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks to everyone who's taken part in this meeting, and I look forward to the Q&A. Cheers.
Thanks, George, for that. Really grateful. Thanks, you've summed it up incredibly well. What I'll do now, we had lots of questions in advance of this meeting. What I'll do now is I'll go into the chat as well, because there's been a whole range of chat questions that have come in as well, and they're terrific. Let me just try and choose a few, and then Paul, we can get you and other panel members to come back in on some of these questions. Okay, here's one. Mary Cousins asks, how can we make the Retired Members Conference more effective? It must cost a fortune, but every year report backs from the top table indicate that no or little action has been taken on motions from previous years. Paul, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I thought Ruby made a good point when she was speaking. When I went on picketing in the miners' strike in 1984-5, there were people on the picket line who were obviously not working down a mine. They were obviously over 75 years old. And I started talking to them. And the NUM made no distinction between retired and working. There was no such thing. In their heads, if you remember the NUM, you would remember the NUM. And you could call on that union. They had no distinction whatsoever. And that was true of a lot of the unions. And I think it's part of this, you know, we don't want conferences that are talking shops and bits of jollies for people, because people have other things they could be doing. And I think that part of what I'm saying as being General Secretary is we need some sort of lay body in the union to look at how motions are carried out, because you should be reporting to the NEC or the National Retired Members Committee how you've advanced the policies passed at the conference. And Jon Rogers touched on it. You know, the most interesting conference for me to go to would be the conference of the motions that's ruled out of order at the National Delegate Conference. That would be a riveting conference. And it sounds like the same is true with the retired members. And I am very much of the view that the job of the National Retired Members Committee is to report back to the retired members on the imposition of the policies that have been passed at the conference. That's democracy. Democracy goes hand in hand with accountability. It's not about, oh, we'll have a conference and then we'll have another one the year after. Oh, and it's in Brighton the year after that. It's about what have we done with the policies that we've debated democratically. It's about carrying them out and making sure that the elected bodies of the union can police how they're carried out and can complain if they're not.
I'll come back to other panel members, but this is a sort of a similar sort of question in the same theme, and others might want to comment on this. And this is a question from Ruth Appleton. And so that I didn't want Keir Starmer for Labour leader, but I wasn't asked before Unison Labour Link made the decision for me. A lot of us were very angry about that. Would you support more democratic processes for the Labour Link Committee? Paul, you kick off, but Jon Rogers, maybe you want to have a view on this as well.
Right. Well, I've made my position clear in both a couple of videos that I've done and in the manifesto that every single Unison member should know what decisions we're going to make, where we're going to make them, who's going to make those decisions beforehand, and how that debate's going to take place. And it should be reported back to them by the union, not the national press, by the union, what decision has been made by that body. That's democracy. Anything else is behind closed doors. And it isn't, you know, when we nominated Jeremy Corbyn, it isn't, people are really clear. If there's a process that's transparent and open and it makes a decision, and they knew about that process, they'll stand by it. That our members are democratic. They understand that, you know, if they have a strike ballot, I know loads of members who voted no in strike ballots, but come out on strike in the strike because they've stood by the decision. They've understood the process. They've understood who's making the decision. They've understood the democracy of it. And that's all it's about. Every single member in the union who pays the Labour Link affiliation should have known what process we're going to be. It shouldn't have been a surprise. It's a surprise of others people. The democracy and the accountability avoid surprises.
Yeah.
John and Bernie wants to come in as well. John and then Bernie.
Well, if I can just touch back on the previous point about the Retired Members Conference, I think what's relevant to that is one of Paul's other campaign pledges about devolving more resources to branches. Because I think if branches have a bigger share of the resources of the union, then they can resource retired members' organisation at a branch level, so that the retired members' organisation of the union can become something that operates organically from the top to the bottom of the union throughout. And I think that would be really interesting and empowering. As far as Unison Labour Link is concerned, I think we have to recognise it was designed to be completely undemocratic. Ironically, it's, if anything, slightly less undemocratic than the arrangements most other unions have for their relationships with Labour Party work, because someone had to write down how it was done at the time of merger. But it's always been a disgrace. And whilst the General Secretary of the Union can't just snap his fingers and change it, whoever he is or she is, I think that the union needs to embark upon a real process of reviewing its political funds, not like we've been through in the past, which were always designed to get us back to where we started from effectively. We need to have the political fund under the control of conference, under the control of the union, under the control of the membership. And the separate committee structures that exist for our political funds are simply a device to distance members from control over the political activity of the union. And they're unacceptable, and they always have been. And it's long past time that they were pensioned off.
These two questions actually strike at the heart of what Paul is all about and what the future of the union is all about as well. So I'm going to bring in the other panel members too. Bernie, you wanted to come in.
Well, yeah, to concur with what Jon was saying about how dysfunctional the Labour link is. And just an anecdote, when Jon, Paul and myself were on the NEC, each year the NEC would elect 12 people to serve on the Labour Link committee. So it didn't matter who were the new NEC members, that would happen every year. And every year, Jon, Paul and myself would come 13th, 14th and 15th. We never ever got on that Labour Link committee from the NEC because we would be deemed to be troublemakers. So I think the Labour Link is completely dysfunctional. Thousands of people pay a percentage of the subs into that fund and have absolutely no say whatsoever. The National Delegate Conference can't discuss anything to do with the Labour Link. The only way you can change the rules of Labour Link is through the Labour Link Committee. And I can say, the only thing I can say is Paul would engender a culture of change, real change. Were those people that, for want of a better word, some of them are just voting fodder, I think would disappear and we would get better people through. So for both questions that were asked about the Retired Members Conference, it is about having a general secretary that genuinely wants to empower people, that isn't afraid of discussion and debate. So vote for Paul.
George?
Oh, thanks, Jon. Two quick points regarding Retired Members Conference, and I think Ruby wants to come in on that as well. It would make a great improvement if, in fact, that conference were allowed to discuss meaningful motions. And I speak from the experience of one of the contributors to the discussion, Ruth Appleton, who drafted, with some assistance from me, a motion regarding social care, and in particular, treatment of the workforce and social care. It was deemed not once but twice beyond the remit of the retired members conference, which to me speaks volumes. And secondly, with regards to the Labour link, I would echo what Jon Rogers and Bernie have already said, but I'll be brutally frank as well. In the context of the Labour leadership election at the start of this year, we saw Unison declare for Sir Keir Starmer on the day when parliamentary nominations opened. There was no consultation, as we've already heard, and I think there was a decision taken by the so-called powers that be that there was never going to be a repetition of what happened in 2015 and 2016 when our union supported Jeremy Corbyn for leader of the party. And what I would also bring comrades' attention to is that in the recent debates around the so-called spike ops legislation, where John and I believe 33 other Labour MPs, possibly 34, did vote against at the final reading of the bill, and in so doing defied the whip. We did not have a peep of criticism of the position which the Starmer leadership took on abstention of what is actually a significant threat to civil liberties in general and a potentially large threat to union activists. I think that spoke volumes, unfortunately, about the relationship that currently exists between the party and the leadership at 130 Euston Road. Another key argument for a dramatic reform and democratization, I think, of Labour Link is if people had had the opportunity of consultation and opted for Keir Starmer, I certainly would have respected that. But the way the process was handled in January of 2020 really, in my view, brought the Labour Link into utter disrepute. Thanks.
Thanks, George. Ruby.
Hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things about retired members conference because well, basically I can't remember the name of the person that asked the question. I just wanted to say that I recognise absolutely what you're saying. Retired members conference resembles nothing so much really as Groundhog Day, because the same motions come up every year, and every year they're passed, and various fine words are said about what's going to be done in the forthcoming year. Nothing's ever done, and the next year the same motion comes around again. There's a whole raft is the word these days, isn't it? A whole raft of measures that are taken to prevent anything meaningful ever being discussed. And what Paul said is exactly right, that it would be wonderful if we could have a motion if we could have a conference with all the motions that have been ruled out of order, because that would be a really, really interesting conference. And we would actually talk about things that weren't just already, pre-agreed. Yes, we're going to agree that, we're going to give that a big tick, and all the rest of it. That would be absolutely brilliant. The other thing, of course, that happens is that the more interesting motions, this, in my experience, I've probably been to about half a dozen retired members conference, is the motions that my retired members committee, what we submitted was often a bit controversial, so it would be put at the end of the agenda, so you'd never get to the end of the agenda. And that brings me to the other point, which is the structure of retired members conference, which is crazy. You spend the whole of the first day doing, like, you've got 2 days, well, 1.5 days really. You've got the whole of the first day doing various kind of caucus meetings and meetings here, and area meetings and group meetings, and then the next day you start on the motions. So you've got a whole pile of motions that you're trying to get through, and then at the beginning of the conference, then you have a speech from the local dignitary that goes on, and that everybody's sitting there thinking, when are we going to get to it? And then in the afternoon you have a speech from Dave Prentice, for God's sake, and then after that you have to try and squeeze in the rest of the motions, and everybody's thinking, come on, we're going to get to my motion. So it's it really is, I'm saying this as much for Paul's benefit as anything, because if you've never been to retired members conference and you're elected, then my God, that should be like somewhere way up on the agenda. It really should. And just one point with regard to Labour Link, my only experience of Labour Link meetings, regional meetings, is as an observer, because even though I never refer to myself as this, but the reality is that I am in fact a Labour politician because I'm a councillor. But I can't take part in Labour Link meet. I'm allowed to observe and I can speak, but I can't vote. I can't actually participate. You know, which anyway, you know what I'm saying. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Ruby. Look, we've run a bit over time, and I'm sorry about that. There's lots of questions that are coming, and what we'll try and do is respond to those online to people and drop them an email back and contact. Okay, a lot of the questions we've tried to cover in the extent of this campaign. What I'd like to do now is just ask Paul to say the last few words, and then we'll come to the end of the meeting. But could I just say this? I just want to repeat what Paul and many of us said. This is the most important election in this union for over a generation, maybe longer. It's going to determine the future of our union, and we've got to take our union back, and that's what we'll mean by electing Paul a rank and file member. And I think we have a responsibility on our own, all our shoulders. Yes, not just to vote ourselves, but to speak to every UNISON member that we know, every retired member that we know, to make sure they come out and vote. The retired members section could be the deciding vote in this election. I desperately need for the future of our union. Paul, would you like to say a few words just before we go?
Thank you, Chair. I think when I speak to a lot of people in the union, particularly people who are in the Labour Party, but not exclusively people who are in the Labour Party, that what they have experienced is that their politics hasn't particularly changed since they were in the 20s. What's happened is the whole of the establishment has shot away somewhere. The things that we took for granted, like job security, pensions, early retirement, continuous retirement, reduction in the retirement age, it's them that have become unrealistic, according to people. And irony is such a funny thing. You know, I saw a quote this morning from Lady Astor when she was out campaigning, Tory MP out campaigning in a general election, and advising poor people that they should eat fish head soup and how to make it. And this bloke put his hand up in the audience and he said, "Could you explain to me, Lady Astor, if we're eating the fish heads, who's eating the fish?" And it's the irony of the situation. I remember when I got on the NEC, first on the Nalgo NEC in the 1980s, I got called to see the president. I got a letter to say I'd broken the rules of the union and could I go and see the president? So I went in and I thought, I can't imagine what I've done. I've only been on about 3 weeks. And you know what I've done? You won't believe this. I've travelled second class on the train to London for the NEC meeting. And they said, it's NEC policy that you must travel first class and you're undercutting the terms and conditions of people who are on the National Executive Council. I says, I wait with bated breath for the publicity surrounding my disciplinary for travel in second class. You know, most members are happy that you've got, you know, they don't want you to walk to London or cycle to London or whatever. I had a lovely letter this morning, an absolutely lovely letter from a bin worker in Kirklees, who was the longest serving bin worker in Kirklees. And he fully supported the campaign, completely appreciated the campaign, and admired the fact that it was on a worker's wage. But he wanted an undertaking from me in writing that I had a clean and comfortable bed to sleep in if I were going to meetings. He didn't want me sleeping in rat-infested circumstances. And that's the sort of conversations that it's about, really, because people are not used to somebody doing something on their behalf. Any rep will tell you this. You know, sometimes it's the lowest of the lowest paid. You do something that's quite simple for them. I've had it happen to me loads of times. And somebody invites you around for a meal to their house, or you just sort something simple out administration-wise on the pension or something. But nobody's ever done anything for them. And that's what the union is about, from the cradle to the grave. You know, the miners who went on strike, a lot of them went on strike so the children would have a job in an area where their fathers and their grandfathers had a job. And there's something more to the union than collecting subscriptions, building prestige buildings, and having a cash-filled bank account. It's about a wider thing. I said this at loads of meetings, say it here today, anybody that's been to the Durham Miners Gala or the Toll Puddle Rally can't fail to be inspired by the banners and the messages on the banners. And that's what the campaign's about. It's about bringing the message down from the banner onto the shop floor to improve the lives of our members. And they need and deserve, it's been humbling to hear cleaners saying, I think Paul can improve my standard of living. And I finish with this quote because I love this quote, and I've only heard it a fortnight ago. It was from a chartist in the 1850s in Wiltshire. And a reporter said to him, I know you want to share the bread on the table. And he said, I don't. I said, I'm putting my life at risk and my livelihood at risk because I want roast beef, plum pudding, loads of beer, and a 3-day week. And you might have some arguments if you're a vegetarian or teetotal with their demands. But by and large, our people, whether they're working or retired, deserve a decent standard of living and a decent income. This is what this campaign's about. The radicalness of the campaign is we want to go to somewhere which is normal. This situation is abnormal. We want to go back to normality. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for everyone attending. We know what we've got to do now. We've got to get that vote out. Thanks for attending this meeting. I hope you've enjoyed it, and let's get out there and win this election. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Bye.
Chair.